Okay, it seems like the pace of people joining us has slowed. So let's get started. 1 second. Hello, everybody, and welcome to PGTME's third annual Lunchtime Lecture Series. My name is Karen Weintraub, and I'm a health reporter for USA Today. Our panelists will be introducing themselves shortly. First, just wanted to say we're really grateful to have you all here. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics housed in the NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Department of Population Health. You can learn more about PGTME on the webpage. Kara is going to drop the link in the chat, and you can sign up for the quarterly newsletter to stay abreast of their work. If you're unable to attend any of the talks this week, PGTME will be posting captioned recordings once the week is over, and we'll share a link with everybody who attended. So we're excited to hear from today's speakers talking about unrealistic expectations and decision-making support. We'll start with brief introductions from each of our panelists, followed by a discussion, and we've allowed time for audience Q&A at the end. We encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A feature throughout the panel discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our panelists to introduce themselves and their work. Let's start with you, Andrew.
All right, perfect. Well, thanks so much, Karen. And before I start, but this always gets left to the end. I want to, thank the people that have organized this, because it has been a very busy time for everybody, especially looking after an entire week of lecture series. So thanks to NYU, thanks Kara. I know John's on, Aiden as well. You've done incredible work for all of this. I know Lauren's taking notes for all of us in case we miss some important things. So a big thank you. So I'm Andrew McFadden. I run 2 patient organizations located here in Canada, but we work globally looking after access to medicines for patients that have rare diseases. I'm going to tackle today's conversation from a bunch of different lenses. Through my organization, we fund clinical trials, and we have four clinical trials that we have funded that are on the go right now, looking at innovative approaches to gene therapies, etc. I also help pharmaceutical companies implement ethical and equitable clinical trials, expanded access programs, etc. And then finally, from a personal lens, my own son has a very rare disease. He was diagnosed with mucopolysaccharidosis type 6 18 years ago, and at the time we were told to sort of go home and enjoy our time that we had with our son, and that if he made it past his 12th birthday, we should feel lucky. And today he's 18. He is in university and doing very well. He's a very exclusive program in university, and he's beating the odds. And so I can sort of answer any questions based on all of those different lenses that I put before you. So thanks again, and I'll turn it over to you, Karen. Great,
thank you so much. Georgia, you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Karen. So I'm Georgia. I'm a pediatric neurologist in Toronto, and I'm currently still doing more training in pediatric neuromuscular disease at Sick Kids for finishing this year, and then going off into practice full-time for neuromuscular after that. It's really a pleasure to be here. We see a lot of children with rare diseases, and I've been working with Andrew on a paper, sort of developing an interest in this topic. So I'm glad to be able to contribute whatever insights I have, and also hear from all the other wonderful speakers today.
Great. Now moving south of the border, John, you want to represent America here?
I guess. Hello, everybody. My name is John Masambe. I'm a clinical navigator here in Seattle, Washington. I am also a sickle cell survivor, and also work directly with sickle cell patients and helping them navigate through complexities of their healthcare system. So I'm very happy to be here.
Great. And last but definitely not least, Cynthia.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Tifft. Good afternoon. I am a physician scientist. Since 2009, I have been at the National Institutes of Health as the Deputy Clinical Director of the Genome Institute. I also run the pediatric portion of the Undiagnosed Diseases Program here at the NIH in Bethesda. My training is as a pediatrician and a geneticist. And for years, I was the chief of genetics and metabolism at Children's National Hospital. So I saw a lot of different kids, a lot of different diseases. And then in 2009, when I moved to the NIH, my focus really was on undiagnosed diseases and lysosomal storage disorders that affect the brain, particularly Tay-Sachs disease, Sandhoff disease, and a condition called GM1 gangliosidosis. All three of these disorders, as Andrew well knows, are uniformly fatal. They have no approved therapies. So after we did a 10-year natural history study for patients with GM2 and GM1, along with our colleagues at the University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School and Auburn University College of Veterinary Medicine, we launched a AAV9 gene therapy trial in May of 2019 for children and infants with GM1 gangliosidosis. We just finished enrolling our 12th and final patient of this phase last week, hence the clinical interruption. And we are, it was, as I said, orchestrating writing this investigational new drug application, and the IRB submission was probably the steepest learning curve of my professional life. My formal graduate coursework in medical ethics goes back way long time ago when I was at the Institute of Religion in the Texas Medical Center, and that was in the late 70s. So if you do the math, you can figure out, yes, I am the old fart on the panel. Now, I have to say that as a federal employee, I have no conflicts of interest or disclosures, and I must tell you that the views I express during this hour are mine. They do not represent the views or policies of the National Human Genome Research Institute, the NIH, or the Department of Health and Human Services.
Thank you. Appreciate the disclosure. Actually, why don't we start with you, since you just brought that up, because I was going to ask you about that trial. What have you learned from that in terms of managing expectations for both outcomes and the time and energy commitment it requires on the part of families to be involved in a gene therapy trial?
Well, you know, we did this, the majority of this trial we did during the pandemic, which added an extra layer of difficulty in one sense, but in another sense, the entire NIH Clinical Center was fairly empty. But it involved really sitting down with families. And this we didn't, you know, we had to learn over time, and talking with families about the commitment they were making, not only to spend weeks here at the beginning of the trial, because this was a first in human trial, but being available to come back for routine follow-ups at 3 months, 6 months. And because it's an AAV trial, we were required by the FDA to do safety follow-up evaluations for a total of 5 years. So we are now 3.5 years into the trial. So our first, you know, the first patient we treated is, you know, 3.5 years out. So we still have a long way to go. In, you know, follow up with these patients. It's been particularly difficult in the current scenario with COVID, especially since many of our patients come from Europe or from outside of the United States. And I have to say, some of the families have been incredibly good about follow-up visits and being here, you know, when they needed to be. And some not so much. I think part of the issue, and, you know, I'm sure Andrew can speak to this as well, is that with gene therapy, it's a one and done. And when you run a clinical trial, it is a trial. Everything you do in the trial is completely voluntary as the recipient, you know, as the patient or the subject. And you can decide you're going to get your gene therapy and then never show up again. So, you know, obviously that may help you if the trial is successful, but it certainly doesn't help the rare disease community in gaining more knowledge and being able to move, you know, a treatment forward. So we go, you know, to great lengths to try to explain to patients that, yes, it's a burden. Yes, it's a big time commitment. And you're not just helping your child, you're helping the whole disease community.
Right. Andrew, you want to pick up on that? Talk about your own situation?
Yeah, I mean, everything that was just said is bang on, and how difficult it is to engage, not just, you know, for those first few months as the trial's progressing, as the infusion comes over. It's basically, you know, you talk 5 years safety follow-up. This is lifelong follow-up, really, if we look at, you know, what we're doing with gene therapies, et cetera. And, you know, you have the added complexity that sometimes these gene therapies begin and patients are, you know, 14 years old and and parents provide consent, but then they cross over sort of that age of consent, and then it's up to them whether they want to go back. I mean, for us, we traveled to Italy for Isaac to participate in a gene therapy trial, and we lived there for 6 months, and that was like a big ask for Isaac. It was a big ask for my other son Gabriel, and for us to leave our jobs, etc. But the expectation was that, you know, that early payoff would lead to better quality of life following the trial. Maybe he wouldn't need enzyme replacement therapy on a weekly basis, etc. But now that we have to fly back and forth to Italy every 6 months, and he's in university, and they don't ask us about this. They ask Isaac about this because he's signed a reconsent form because he turned 18, and now the decision is up to him. And so trying to make sure that he remains engaged in the trial for the betterment of others has been a bit of a challenge, and we're the people that initially funded this trial, and so I can't imagine what it's like for the other people that are in the trial flying out from all over the world every 6 months for this type of follow-up. So it can be very difficult, and I think that, you know, transparency with families about what that expectation is right off the get-go is vitally important, but also being able to stay in contact with them through the duration of all of these years to let them know how valuable their participation is, how important it is for their own safety, but for the safety of others. And, you know, a lot of people get into these trials for themselves, but also for that altruistic sort of push for the patient community, and really hitting home how important it is to get these follow-up studies and this follow-up data for the trial and for future patients is very key to managing what those expectations are for a long-term trial.
John, do you face this as well with your patients, encouraging them to continue participating, or are they not in clinical trials generally?
Actually, my case is a little bit different when we talk about the patients I work with, or at least the community I'm involved with. Just to kind of backpedal just a little bit, I work a lot with sickle cell. I'm not sure if everybody is aware what sickle cell disease is. It's a genetic disease that pretty much affects your red blood cells, and is predominantly in Black African American patients. It's something that, you know, initially there was no cure whatsoever. But until recently, there have been a few therapies that have come about where people can do a bone marrow transplant as a cure, but not everybody has to do a bone marrow transplant. For that to be successful, you need a donor or someone who can match you, but not everybody has access to that. So gene therapy kind of came in as a potential cure. But what we've been getting on our end is the hesitation that we've been getting is that a lot of patients, I'm going to report based on what the community is reporting to me. The patients are reporting. Gene therapy, when you hear a lot of these things, there's a lot of trouble. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think you're okay.
Am I okay now?
Yep, think so.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure where we stopped at, but in the African American community, there's a lot of historical trauma. So when you mention things such as gene therapy, it's something that is triggering, because not everybody would think of unethical, you know, practices changing, you know, people's DNA. So we're having a hard time to try to talk to patients and inform them that this is a potential cure. There's a lot of like transparency where we're engaging with providers. Like right now, we're working directly with providers at St. Jude Children's Hospital, where they are conducting gene therapy trials. But the biggest issue is the commitment as well, telling patients and families to travel from a different state to come to, you know, to St. Jude and be able to commit, take time off work. It's expensive. Not everybody can afford to do that. So finance is a big thing, commitment, and also the education piece of that as well. So that's where we get to have a lot of hesitation. But the more we inform the patients and the families, you know, the community is much more likely so far they're opening up to the idea of gene therapy. It's more of a sense of hope now for those who don't have an opportunity to have like maybe a bone marrow donor. Yeah, so that's kind of where we're at.
Right.
Yes.
I talked to a family actually last week where the son, who's a 16-year-old son, is not interested in gene therapy because he's okay with the way things are. But the mom is like, you need to get this so we don't have to deal with this for the rest of your life. So same kind of tension. Georgia, did you want to jump in on this?
Sure, these are all super important points and great examples as well. I think one thing that came to mind was, the importance of thinking about what kind of outcome measures we're going to expect patients to have follow-up to obtain. I think when it comes to our drugs that, even beyond clinical trials, when we actually have approval of the drugs and we're using them, we still have to obtain information. Some of these drugs are so new that we don't have in data on them beyond 5 years, and we need to be able to continue to obtain that to inform patients moving forward on what to expect. And by no means are we using the word cure yet for any of these conditions, as you guys well know. So thinking about what's reasonable to expect of patients. Some of our tests are painful, like EMGs, or invasive, like blood work. It's easy enough for drugs that need ongoing treatment and have outcome-based reimbursement criteria, because then the parents and the families are motivated themselves to continue to have follow-up. But when it comes to gene therapies, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that these patients receive the therapy and do, to some extent, have to be altruistic when it comes to having follow-up. But it is quite a burden on families to have to continue to take time off work to come to the hospital. We just have to, I think, be mindful of what we're expecting.
Right. Maybe Cynthia, you can take this on, and then the others. How do you convey that risk realistically to parents? Obviously they're jumping at the hope, but there also is, as we know from gene therapy, the risk of side effects or just ineffectiveness at this point. Oop, you're muted.
And yeah, you're absolutely right, Karen. And in diseases like ours, that for which there is no other therapy and is progressively degenerative, if there's no other choice, the families are looking at this. This is my hope. This is going to work. And I think you really do have to tamp down expectations, because they know this is their only hope at that point, but they need to realize what the commitment is and what it means down the line. If a better gene therapy comes along, their child won't be eligible because they will have already received a gene therapy. So I find myself almost trying to discourage them in order to tamp down expectations, because off the bat, they're just, where do I sign? Without, reading through or actually going through the 13 pages or 20 pages or whatever it is now of disclaimers and risks. As far as they're concerned, the highest risk is doing nothing.
Andrew, do you see that as well, or how do you negotiate?
I do, and we field questions from families all the time. We looked at this from our own perspectives as well about how we make the decision to go into a trial. And I think that the key here, again, is honesty and transparency with that patient community from a very early stage, from a clinician stage, but also patient advocacy organizations have a big part to play in all of this, as they're starting to sort of give information about which trials are out there, as they're communicating during patient events and patient symposium and that sort of thing. It's easy to get caught up in that hype and hope that's out there, because all of that hype and hope that's out there is traditionally out there because of the pharmaceutical companies or the sponsors that are putting, press releases out about early stage results or early stage hopes or breakthroughs and all of these other, PR, words and catchphrases that they use that aren't really targeted to our patients and our families. They're targeted towards investors in order to continue, increasing, potential investment in what some of these quote unquote promising or curative therapies might be. And you know, if you've got families rolling into a very early stage trial, I see that there's a question, maybe we can address this a little later on, where that dose of a gene therapy is really low and it's only looking to make sure that it's safe. The potential for efficacy on that is virtually non-existent. And so to be able to say to families, you know, you need to slow down, you need to sort of make an informed decision about whether to participate in a trial, when you're going to, you know, decide to, you know, get into that trial, whether it's at an early stage, mid stage, end stage. For us, we thought we were getting in at the highest dose, and we've seen this data roll in over the last 15 years since we began funding the trial. And after looking at Isaac's data, which we thought was the highest dose, they then doubled that dose for the next cohort. And so even if you have all of that information at hand, even if you're sort of astute at you know, pulling it apart, or like us have access to basically every speck of data that exists, you can still make that incorrect decision. And for us, we were well informed that this might happen, but with other families that may just be saying, this is our only hope, we need to get in, they'll get that dosage and it may lead to nothing. And then, as you said, you know, where do you go? You're ineligible at the moment for a future clinical trial using the same vector. And so I think that, you know, if we all work together in a collaborative fashion to educate these patients, educate these families, educate patient organizations as well, but also, you know, clinicians and principal investigators, to make sure that those expectations are realistic as families are going into this, I think it's vitally important.
Right. And even intellectually, you may know that you've done the best you can, but it's still heartbreaking to know that there are other options that come along later, I'm sure. John, can you talk a little bit about, with the people you work with are not as well educated as Andrew, don't have that access necessarily. How do you deal with people who you really are just at the beginning, I assume, just building basic trust?
That's exactly where I was actually going to tap in right after Andrew just finished, because not everybody has. We need to understand, like, these therapies are available, right? And the people conducting the therapies are, you know, they have all the best intentions. However, sometimes it's really, we also have to look at what we're asking of the patients and their families to meet them halfway. Educating, you know, education doesn't necessarily have to, you know, just to come in and present a bunch of, like, you know, slides and show them, you know, this is what it is, this is what therapy can do, right, to make it all look good. Now, what we can do, like one of the best things we did last year when we were in Chicago was St. Jude. They invited us, they brought up a couple families from all over the country and flew them to for a conference, and then this sat down with patients, caregivers, their family members, and it was like a 3-day weekend education session and bonding, and that kind of created a line of trust, because we engaged in conversations where providers could they're like, well, this is what we hope to do, to learn, but then the patients and families like, nah, we don't trust that, we're not so sure about this. So but just that conference alone, we ended up engaging in conversation that you could see the tension slowly dying down, and more became more like a conversation between two people with different, with different backgrounds. And what we learned in that moment, as much as the trials are meant for good, we need to be also conscious of what we're asking the families to also give up on. Taking time off work is really, really hard. Affordability, also the historical trauma in the Black community, that is a big piece. And not everybody, being patient with the people that you are asking to participate in the trials, that is also a key factor. But just the idea of being able to bond, that was very helpful. They flew them out. And then also, letting, and another part that I really enjoy, that I think is very, very helpful is, creating a streamline of communication about, I would say, cultural literacy is very important as well. Culture sensitivity is very important as well. Um, but training providers to understand the community and the population that they want to work with, um, that was, is really helpful. But then also giving them resources, community resources around them. Like, hey, although you're concerned about gene therapy, you could take time off work. Like right now, we work with patients that I can help them. We have what we call the wash to paid medical leave, where you can take time off work based on your own, time off work to focus on your serious illness for yourself and for your family member. If I'm able to inform them about that, they could do that. Educating them about, Social Security disability or temporary disability. That way, they could understand, like, oh, this resource is available to me. Then that will buy me time to be able to focus on this, so that I don't have to worry how I'm going to pay my next bill, how I'm going to pay rent, because at least I still have a source of income coming in. And then also compensation too. From the trial coordinators. That's another big piece as well. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of where the community is and where we can make them. Yes.
But it can be challenging to scale those kinds of activities for sure. Georgia,
Yes.
do you want to? Yeah, sorry.
Oh, yes, it does.
Thanks, John. I think everything that you said really resonated, and I thought that you made such important points. The piece about cultural literacy, I think, is so important, and I think when we're dealing with these novel therapeutics, oftentimes we're talking about the families that and the patients that almost undermine risk and are jumping at the opportunity at these and kind of quenching expectations and to make sure they're making an informed decision. But what we don't often talk about and consider is the families and the patients who maybe want to decline treatment for personal reasons, for cultural reasons, and how we're having those conversations. I think when it comes to pediatrics, there's the added layer of complexity that we want to do what's best for the patient, but we're also wanting to support the family as a whole unit. And what we think is best for the patient isn't necessarily what is best for the patient from the parent standpoint and from the family and from, for numerous reasons, especially because we don't have a crystal ball with these therapies. And so being very careful about how we're counseling and being mindful of the perspective the patients are coming from and their families is so important and not always easy to do, especially when we have all of our own biases when we talk to parents.
Andrew, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, so we tend to believe that every parent wants access to all of these novel gene therapies, and some of the most difficult conversations I've had is with parents that feel like it's not the right time, and they feel poorly for that because they are feeling like maybe they're letting their child down. And we're talking, parents that have been dealing with this for 5, 6, 7 years. It's a progressive disease. The logical outcome of what these diseases will result in are pretty dramatic, but at the same time, they may have access to an enzyme replacement therapy that provides them with a bit of a lifeboat until such time as better gene therapies come along. And so making sure that we can support those families is really important from a patient advocate's perspective. But from Georgia has a very, very difficult job because she's right, she has to deal with both the child and their best interests and the parents and their best interests. And I think that if we're able to continue to keep a dialogue going with all of those key stakeholders in order to be consistent in our messaging, that'll be better for everybody in the end. And I'm fortunate that we're able to do that, and I know the folks at Say Kids do a remarkable job making sure that those families have their expectations kept in check, for sure.
Right. Couple of questions from the audience. What programs are available for caregivers and families to receive emotional and mental support before, during, and after dosing in a gene therapy trial? I don't know who wants to take that one. Volunteer. Andrew?
I can go first.
Okay.
Early on, I realized that we didn't do a very good job with this. We'd looked at for the MPS6 clinical trial out of Italy. In order to sort of look at filling that trial, we did antibody testing on, the 12 or 13 patients that were here in Canada. And that was done at Montreal Children's Hospital. And it gave us a good sense of who might be able to participate in this trial rather than sending them all the way over to Italy and then coming back to say they had these antibodies, et cetera. And I think we really dropped the ball on providing support for patients when they found out that they weren't eligible for this trial. And it was an eye opener for me. You think of everything, and this was something that we didn't. And I had a parent call to say, oh my gosh, this was our only hope, the only thing that we've been looking toward for a long time. And now we can't do this. What do I do? And, I'm not in a position to be a social worker in this. And, I did my best to be able to connect them back up with, the physician in Montreal, but also the clinical trial team in Italy. It talked to them a lot about what the future of gene therapy looks like and how quickly we're moving in order to beat antibodies. And I know that was part of the discussion yesterday, but it is something that all of us are really keen and engaged on making sure it can be solved, whether it's through really novel approaches. There's some approaches that are currently in existence, but that's cold comfort for these families. And so I feel like, we did a poor job early on for that. We want to make sure that there are people now that can connect with these families if there are devastating results that come from not being able to access antibodies. But I think as part of a clinical team as well, these should be built into trials, that support is there, not just for antibodies, but what if results come back and they're not as stunning as the hopeful press releases had led you to believe? Or what if you need to make a decision about going back on enzyme replacement therapy if levels sort of from gene therapy aren't high enough? And I feel like a good clinical trial design incorporates those types of supports. I think as well, for patient organizations, there needs to be consistent follow-up with these families as time goes by. We're talking, not just, hey, you're into the trial, good job, what can we do? Can we get you there? Can we look after accommodations, travel, etc.? It's how are things going and how are you receiving information? And is there anybody that we can connect you with that's also part of the trial that you can have a discussion with? And those are really important, I think, in order to help manage what some of these difficult conversations can be like.
That brings up tons of other questions, but John, did you want to jump in on that point? The initial question about follow-up.
Yes, one of the things that we're doing, at least on our end, is create moments to engage, like with the way we help patients and caregivers regarding mental health and support. In our sessions, we often have a spiritual health, they kind of like, it's a spiritual health, coordinator person, but they're more like a social worker as well, whereby they could contact for, they're able to create a safe space for people to open up, and also, but in a religious manner, because at least I do know the patients I directly work with, they have a heavy presence, religion and faith and spirituality is very, very important to them. So to make some of these decisions, they have to, yes, although there's science involved, but also faith is very, very important in my community. So to commit to it, you have to have, you need to have that presence of, the consciousness of self, and say, you know what, God, I'll let you take this on, although I'm making an informed decision, but I'm also going on faith. So that kind of gives them a peace of mind, gives the community a peace of mind. And then on the other part too, we do weekly sessions with the community, with the patients that I work with, whereby we try to meet every Wednesday and just check in, say, how's your week? We don't necessarily even have to talk about gene therapy. We could be just a conversation of like, oh, how's school going? Oh, as a mom, with a kid with a disability, how are you holding up? Because also caregivers tend to commit a lot of their lives for the kid, and also you forget to take care of yourself, because every commitment, the decision that you're making, you put in the kid first, and then you forget to take care of it every Wednesday, or every now and then, where we just check in with the moms and parents and sisters, just for them to have that safe space to realize there's other people also going through this, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about the illness. It could be something as simple as, you've been sleeping lately, you watched the game, how is he holding up, right? So that the conversation doesn't always have to be focused on the illness, because kids and parents they're surrounded by that every day. So even in the sessions where we meet, it doesn't necessarily, have to be the subject. However, what we realize now, they're able to open up more. There's less anxiety, a little bit more stress. It's a place where they could, disengage from the illness, and actually that's built the relationship a lot more. And we have the providers as well come in those conversations and those meetings, and that has really, 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 really helped. We'll hope to engage a little bit more now, now that we'll learn more about the gene therapy in sickle cell disease. So that's kind of where we're at with that.
Cool. I noticed, Andrew, there was a knowing smile there when John was talking about caregivers and the burden and stress. And obviously there's more to life than the disease, even when you're coping with the disease. And so trying to remember that or connect with that can be a challenge. Another question from the audience: how do you ethically enroll a child in a first human trial at the lowest dose, given the unlikelihood of it being effective? Maybe Cynthia, you want to take that one on? How did you convince families to join?
Actually,
yeah.
I think, we had a long discussion about that, and I think actually it's not very ethical if you're enrolling a family at a dose that is not going to be effective. When we started the trial, we actually started with a dose, and that was the only rational way we could do it. Started with the dose that had been effective in the cat model of GM1. And actually, it was very effective. It wasn't a very high dose by today's standard, but it was the effective dose. And so the first several patients we treated was with this rather low in the community standards dose, but it was the dose that had been effective, and it has been. So I'm not sure I would look favorably on just a starting dose that one knew was not. I don't think that's ethical to start with a dose that is not going to be effective.
But still, with phase 1, it's hard to tell what the effect is going to be and what the side effects are going to be, obviously.
Well, exactly, because really you're two sides of the coin here. If you treat with the lowest dose that is going to be effective, that's kind of where you have to start, because what if you have massive side effects?
Right.
Well, then, if you started with a higher dose, then you say, oh, well, gee, I should have started with that low effective dose to begin with. So it's a balancing act.
Georgia, you want to get in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add, it totally is. And it has to, come with transparency with the participants that we just don't know. And that has to be part of the informed decision. I think this is also relevant for dose dependent or per kilo dependent dosing for pediatric patients. And so we don't know sometimes right off the bat to what's the threshold after which it becomes more dangerous. And we've seen that with, for example, our SMA gene therapy, where at a certain per kilo dosage, it becomes, the same per kilo dosage, but for a larger child, it obviously becomes more dangerous. So that does come with an ethical challenge. I think it just speaks to the importance of transparency and having that be part of the consent that they provide and the informed decision. And it also speaks to the ethical challenge of the families that are willing to kind of go for these things without considering the potential side effects, and how we have to carefully counsel them to manage those expectations.
And just the difficulty of living with that uncertainty. Especially when it's, if you take it on yourself, that's one thing, but to take that uncertainty on behalf of your child is really got to be one of the hardest things to do as a parent.
Yeah, I'll quickly add there, like, and this isn't sort of in the pediatric context, but when you're looking at those low dose trials, oftentimes trials will actually only enroll older patients that can consent for themselves, and we saw that with the Hunter syndrome gene editing trial out of San Francisco, and that patient, he was 18 or 20 years old or something like that, and made it very clear that he knew that there would probably be no benefit for this, but also knew that that starting point needed to take place. And he was very, very open in with the media, etc., that his expectations were low. And I think that was part of the clinical team that helped manage those expectations before he agreed to sign up and be the first to have that gene editing done. And so credit to them, credit to the team, but oftentimes that ethical decision doesn't need to be made, for young children or parents deciding on behalf of their young children, if it's possible that there's some adults within that patient population that can participate and decide that that's where they want to go.
Right. Makes sense. Another issue is obviously there's a lot of loneliness involved when you're making these decisions and you're joining a trial, and there's a tendency to turn maybe to social media or to groups, to peers who may have a totally different experience, or there may be, misinformation that gets out there. How do you handle that, what's going on with social media and expectations? Cynthia, you want to...
It's difficult, especially in situations with rare disease.
Right.
I will be honest with you, we have a dozen patients in our trial, and I would say 10 out of the 12 at least are constantly on social media or, talking back and forth with each other about their own experience. And I would say in several cases, others in the trial, other families in the trial actually find out some things before I do.
Right.
So I had my families, sending messages from the hospital to other people that were in the trial, and you can't exactly, tell them they can't do that.
Right.
And it's, and even if you don't do a lot of that, and in our situation, it's a very rare disease and word travels very quickly through the advocacy community. And, the word gets out there, if it's very positive or very negative, it gets out there very quickly.
Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, and I mean, Cindy's right. You can't tell them that they can't sort of communicate with each other. They all have access and should have access to all of the data from, what's gone on previously, but also how things are going, for people that have been infused after them, because that's part of open access to the data for the trial, et cetera. But I think it's really important to hammer home how challenging things might be for future patients and for the protection of the clinical trial, to tell patients and families, maybe we shouldn't be posting on social media any results. Maybe we shouldn't have a Facebook group where we're doing that. And for patient organizations, that's a good opportunity for them to facilitate a private session, a private group with those individuals that need to seek support, and maybe share stories and really discuss what's gone on in the trial, because there are very few people in this world globally that have participated in something like this. If you look at the total number of people that have been part of a clinical trial, it's very small. A clinical trial for gene therapy, that number is very small. And when you boil it down to an ultra rare disease, there needs to be that support in place. And so I think setting up how that communication, where that support needs to come from, that's part and parcel of making sure that the clinical trial is run well and the supports are in place for those patients. But if somebody, 4 people put out and say we got a rash after the infusion, and that means we know we got a good dose and it's working and that sort of thing, and the other people say, well, we didn't get a rash, and maybe 60% of it's not working, so don't even go in the trial, wait for something else. That could really impact things. And I know that that's a very simplistic look at things, but that's just a small example of how important making sure open communication is sent publicly once data comes in, and it's put out in a transparent fashion rather than via social media groups.
Right, and those seemingly small facts can really sway somebody's opinion, for sure. Just a reminder, if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A. And diving a little bit into the details here, I have some questions about, can some of the long-term monitoring occur more locally? So you had to go to Italy. Couldn't they have monitored you from home, especially with telemedicine and that sort of thing? And then also to curb the travel expenses, is it possible to set up sort of a temporary remote facility, or, you know, are you also spread out that wouldn't be feasible? Andrew, you want to start with that one, I guess?
Yeah, you know, we were able to I think Kara and I and a couple other people have just released a paper about the importance of decentralizing clinical trials, et cetera. There it is. Good job, Kara. She's fast. And, you know, I got a good kick at that because we worked on that really hard, and we had moved some of that trial follow-up to Montreal during the pandemic, because obviously we didn't want people traveling on airplanes, et cetera, and spending their time in Italy. And as soon as that paper came out, we got a note from Italy saying, hey, the pandemic is over, you know, LOL. We need to have everybody come back to Italy for follow-up, because the regulatory authorities don't like that we're having this follow-up in different centers. It wasn't part of that initial clinical trial, you know, paperwork, et cetera. And, you know, when I said, you know, hey, listen, maybe we should, you know, amend some of that paperwork in order to curb that travel and make sure that we're going at a site, the discomfort from the principal investigators was very evident. They want a very controlled collection of data, because sometimes it is just a small bit of efficacy data could get missed or interpreted differently. And yeah, you know, as you know, we'll turn it over to Georgia, who just posted a good thing in our private chat here about this, but they don't want any deviation from that data collection, because it could impact a potential approval. And so I think, you know, clinical trials that are ongoing right now, it would be very difficult and challenging to shift to, but I think designing clinical trials moving forward would be the way to go there. Right.
Georgia, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the double-edged sword of this is that, you know, clinical trials exist like they do as RCTs for a reason, because the data
randomized control trials, RCT, sorry, just
my
for those.
apologies, yeah. You know, or trial designs that we know to have, you know, rigor, not just from an ethical standpoint to protect participants, but also from a data collection analysis standpoint, where we feel like we can trust the data that comes out of it, which is important. And you know, the designs are as they are, and decentralizing data collection, part of the problem of that is that rigor is no longer kind of there. And I think that would be the risk of that. That this speaks to, you know, Andrew and I talked a lot about how to make real world data collection possible in order to kind of get drugs, you know, to people sooner, and then subsequently monitor in a real world data and you know, change outcome based reimbursement and whatnot based on the data that you collect. And part of the scrutiny of real world data collection is that the diagnostic or the data collection rigor from a clinical trial is just not there anymore. We have a lot of work to do still in, you know, being able to mitigate those challenges. I think part of it speaks to what kind of outcome measures we're looking at, because one of the big criticisms of decentralization is, you know, if you're relying on a conversation with the family or the patient, people's subjective experience with their symptoms and how it changes over time and their response to the drug may not always be reflective of objective measures. And we often want objective measures that are standardized in how they're collected. It's not to say there's not a way to decentralize and that it's not important, but I'm not sure that we're quite there yet in how we design trials. I wonder if Cynthia has more.
I was just going to turn to Cynthia.
Yeah, I'm thinking, and we were sort of doing this real time during the pandemic, because there were situations in which families could not travel. Now, there were things obviously in our trial that we wanted to be done on the premises, scans, for example, on the same machine, you know, under the same conditions, because otherwise the data was fairly meaningless. But we did learn that you can do a very, very careful, good neurologic exam via telemedicine with a parent and another person, you know, a husband or a friend, actually helping you do the neurologic exam. And I think if anything good is going to come out of this pandemic, it's going to be ways to do decentralized clinical trials, or at least, have part of them decentralized, with fairly rigorous outcome measures. And I think there's a whole field now that are really working on these, types of trial design that will be rigorous and yet not so onerous for families.
Right. And speaking of outcome measures, sorry.
All right, I just want to follow up. Part
Yeah.
of that question was, how can that, will that help with costs associated with these types of things? And, my organization helps all of the families, pays for their travel and accommodations in Italy. And we provide sort of I feel like a travel agent half of the time, booking flights and making sure everybody's there. And so we've built in that cost into our organization. Perhaps for future trials, we can help shift some of that cost into paying for a decentralized model of things, paying for people that can help, with those neurological exams that are closer to home, et cetera. And there will still be back and forth, but there will still be a cost associated with decentralized trials. I think it would just be shifted, but those barriers would be removed for patients, and it would be better for them.
I also want to say that part of the work to be done is to change the expectations of the regulatory bodies and the funding sources. So, of what kind of outcome measures that they see fit. So this has to be a collaborative effort.
John, I saw you nodding there.
Yeah, I think, just to kind of tap in, expectations we need to find a way to compromise. What we're learning on our end, at least, is finding ways to compromise, because there's two expectations here. One from the trial coordinations, right, from the trials, and then the patient to provider expectations, and then the providers, trying to create some kind of outcome, their expectation of the outcome. But we also need to be conscious of what we're asking the patients to commit to. If the clinical trials are able to meet the patients and families halfway, like Andrew's foundation, what they're doing is actually amazing, to be able to accommodate all that. But then also you look at, organizations that come from, communities that don't have such accessibility, such resources available. But what we can do is, how can we work together? Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yeah, it's cutting in and out a little bit, but yeah.
Oh, that's horrible. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. You were saying about that not every community has access to
not every community has to that kind of resources, which is but what I was hoping is organizations like what St. Jude's doing, and even here in Seattle Children's, is they actually do accommodate patients and families to have them somewhere to stay. They shift them from their homes, give them medical lodging and housing and foods. That way they can at least not have to worry about all these other things. And then also how the data is presented. That is also a key factor in this conversation. Being able to understand the audience, being patient with the audience and the patients and the families to give them time to grow into the idea, to make an informed decision to either commit or not commit. What I'm seeing a lot of conflicting expectations from the provider side and also from the patient side of things. But these conversations help alleviate some of those stresses so that they could feel like there's a compromise, between two sides here. But I think I'm very hopeful. There's a lot of hope. Conversations like this really do help, in the journey to creating pathways to gene therapy in rare diseases.
Amazingly, we're short on time already, but let me throw in at least one more. Any guidance that you have to offer related to validated rating scales to measure caregiver burden and health economic outcomes and the like? This person is interested in measuring outcomes in a way that isn't anecdotal, but more qualitative, maybe could be helpful in developing product labels. Cynthia, do you want to start with that one? Is that, no? Pass that to Andrew?
Let me pass that to Andrew. We've thought about this, but I don't know of any validated measures. We've certainly given it a lot of thought.
Okay.
No, I mean, that's the heterogeneity of what a rare disease actually is. It would be helpful to have a validated measure. There's nothing out there. How do we do it? you got the wrong person. I'm happy to fund that search, of course, because I feel like these are measures that we desperately need, and I think regulators and mostly payers need as well. But yeah, that's a tricky one for me to answer. So I'll pitch in if somebody else is out there that's smarter and can get it sorted.
I'll move on to the next one then. Do you guys think, in the context of rare and conditions with high extreme unmet need, that parents and participants see a bright line between treatment, standard of care versus research or clinical trial, and can adjust their expectations? Is that?
Well, we know parents and patients are willing to take more risks when they are more unmet need out there and the greater severity of disease that exists. And so I think that line does get blurred. And if you were to approach somebody, well, I mean, I know it gets blurred because you approach people and say, listen, this may be an unsafe dose, or this may be a dangerous clinical trial. Some of us on the call were part of, saying that right to try legislation was actually dangerous for parents and patients throughout the United States. And it was because we worried that pharmaceutical companies would be approaching and saying, try this now, try it early, no FDA oversight, no regulation, and maybe we can even charge you for it at the same time. And it's a win-win situation for everybody, except for the reality is that that's not actually the case, and it could create more harm and more damage. But I know that patients reached out to us in droves saying, stay out of this. We get to choose what we want because otherwise we're going to immediately die. And so that line is blurred for sure. And I think, again, it all goes back to all of us managing expectations in an open, collaborative fashion in order to meet the needs of patients that are out there in need. But also at the same time, pushing science forward as fast as we possibly can in an ethically safe fashion.
Great. We only have 2 minutes left. Last words, Georgia, any parting thoughts?
Well, just to sort of piggyback off that and to bring it back to the discussion on social media that we had earlier, but I think that plays a huge role in that piece. Is not only is our patients sometimes willing to disregard some of the potential risk, but there's actually sometimes an advocacy piece where they're going on social media, actually trying to push the institutions and the clinicians to to treat and advocate for a broader, rightfully so, a broader reach of the drug, even though we don't always have the safety and efficacy data for those populations. And so once again, the two-edged sword of social media. But I think that's really challenging sometimes to get those pressures from the various sources.
John, last words. Thank you.
I'm just happy to have engaged in this very, very important conversation, and I'm very, very hopeful. Kara and everybody else, it's been such a pleasure.
Cynthia?
Yeah, I think as clinicians, we have to manage expectations for ourselves. I mean, for these lethal diseases, we want this to work, and we have to put on our blinders and be much more objective, or be objective about whether or not treatments and their outcomes that we're seeing are truly beneficial. But we want this to work for the patients as much as the families want it to work, and so we have to manage our own expectations sometimes.
Right. Andrew, last word.
Yeah, just that, and I say this in almost every panel I'm on, maybe we should be just working really closely with patients and families to walk them along the line of what is possible, what's happening, and how fast we think things are moving in the future. And for all of us to not use the term false hope, because sometimes that's all that families have left is hope, and maybe sort of the language that we use can be thought about, and that misguided hope will help guide them back to a proper path of what hope is, and bringing us all down that road together as institutions, as clinicians, as patient organizations, as parents, and as patients.
In that, as an inspiring end to our conversation. Thank you, Andrew. With that, we're out of time. Thank you all. This was really a fascinating conversation for me and hopefully for you guys. And thank you in the audience for your thoughtful questions. Tomorrow's panel is gene therapy for sickle cell disease. So I'm sure John will be interested in that one, as will the rest of us. And on behalf of PGTME, I'd like to thank everybody who's attended, participated, or especially helped put this webinar together, especially Kara. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you so much.